Good morning and welcome to our message today. If you would please join me in Matthew chapter 8 this morning for the fourth in our series from Matthew chapter 8. This morning, beginning in verse 18, as Jesus describes two very different kinds of disciples. In Matthew chapter 8, verse 18, we'll begin in just a few moments, two different kinds of disciples. So to set the term correctly, just from the outset this morning, what is a disciple? A disciple in the biblical sense, and as Jesus used it here and as the original followers of Jesus would have understood it. A disciple means to be a follower. It was one who sat at the feet of Jesus to learn from him. And it was necessary in that day, if you were going to learn from Jesus, you had to be with him. His public ministry lasted such a comparatively short time. His disciples left everything to come and be with him. You couldn't be a disciple if you weren't close to him. So there was no such thing, as we know, and this goes without saying, but let's say it anyway. There was no Facebook, there was no YouTube, there was no Zoom. If you were going to learn from Jesus, you had to be with Jesus. There was a high cost of discipleship because in order to be with Jesus, you had to leave something else. That part of that is true for us as well. You can't hang on to everything that you want to hang on to and still be a disciple of Jesus. That part still rings true today, even though we have all of this wonderful technology that allows us to stay connected even when we are apart physically. By way of introduction this morning, Eugene Peterson said this: discipleship is long obedience in the same direction. Discipleship is long obedience in the same direction. But in his quote, discipleship assumes that you are moving in a direction. In order for you to be a disciple, you have to be moving with Jesus toward that common goal where he wants you to go. One of our favorite things to do at our house, and I know it is for a lot of you guys also, we love to ride the side-by-side at my house. We've had it for about 2 years now, so that means that when we got it, our girls were 9 and 11. And so we've never really had anything like that before. So one of the most important things as we're figuring out how to drive the thing, one of the most important things is, how do you make it stop and how do you make it go? We've had the thing 2 years now, and the girls love to drive it. And still, sometimes when they get in it, close the door, turn on the key, I still sometimes get the question, Daddy, which one's the brake and which one's the gas? And so I finally figured out an easy way to explain this. The gas pedal goes up and down, like yes, it means go. The brake pedal goes side by side, side to side, like shaking your head, it means no, stop. Yes, up and down means go. Brake pedal this way means stop. It's simple, right? So we know how to make things go and stop. And that simple question of how do I make this go and stop? It's simple in operating a vehicle once we figure out how to do that. But still, as a grown-up, even though we know how to do a lot of complicated things physically, as a grown-up, it's hard to make those decisions. It's hard to know sometimes, is it time for me to go? Is it time for me to stop? How do I know what to do? How do I follow? Last week, we looked at both the public ministry and the private ministry of Jesus here in Matthew chapter 8. Verses 14 to 15, we see the private ministry as Jesus comes home from a wearying day in the synagogue, and he performs a miracle and heals Peter's mother-in-law. And then after that very long day, there are incredible crowds that come up. There is the public ministry of Jesus in which he healed all the people in that region. There was the public ministry of Jesus and the private ministry of Jesus. We saw in that text last week the incredible versatility of Jesus, his total commitment to obedience that brought him to serve in whatever conditions, whatever circumstances were there. It was his commitment to always follow what was supposed to be done that brought him to serve in whatever circumstances presented themselves. And so if there was a crowd, Jesus was not intimidated. But also at the same time, if there was not a crowd, Jesus was humble enough to do that. So the public ministry and the private ministry of Jesus, the incredible versatility of Jesus that flowed from his commitment to always doing the work of the Father. And that becomes our example as well. And so this week there are two very different prospective disciples. And so the thing that they have in common is that they both recognize on some level that Jesus is worthy of being followed. And so I think a lot of you, maybe all of you listening today, you recognize on some level that Jesus is worthy of being followed. but your level of commitment differs from person to person. You're not really sure how to live this out. And so that's what's fascinating about this text, is that these two people come from different backgrounds. They're at different levels of commitment, and Jesus deals with them differently. Jesus had made this statement over and over again through the disciples, through the Gospels. This statement, this broad statement, follow me. If anyone wants to come after me, let him take up his cross and follow me. Follow me. He calls out to specific people, but also generally, follow me, come and be my disciples. We talk about cultural background a lot because it's important for us to realize what was going on at the time that Jesus said these things. And so the fact that Jesus would just point at random people and say, you, come and follow me, the fact that Jesus would issue an open invitation to crowds of people to come and follow him, that made him incredibly different. And I want to talk about why for just a moment, because in our text this morning, we're talking about discipleship, and one of the people that comes to Jesus this morning refers to him as a teacher or rabbi. And that's how most of the people related to Jesus in that day. So here's how that relationship normally worked between the rabbis and the public in that day. It was an incredibly solemn and proud thing to be a rabbi in the time of Christ. They were held in great regard, those teachers of the law. And so it was something that people aspired to, would be for their sons to be accepted into one of these rabbinical schools. And that preparation would begin very early. And it was incredibly competitive to get into the best schools, because one of the main things about these schools was that you had to be highly intelligent, and especially you had to be good at memorizing scripture. You had to be able to memorize vast chunks of the law of Moses. And so if a young man showed an ability to do that, he was more likely to be accepted into one of the more higher-ranked rabbinical schools. And it was a thing of pride for his family, for him to be accepted into one of those. And so how that normally went was, if a young man was incredibly intelligent, he would get picked up into one of these rabbinical schools. If he did not necessarily any shame in that, but he would grow up and go into the family business, whatever that might happen to be. But the distinguishing thing about that, and I read this several years ago and it stuck with me, was that a rabbi would not ever put himself in a position of going to a family and saying, your son is brilliant, will you please send him to my school? Your son is such an incredible young man, he would be such an asset to my school. Because that would put the rabbi in the position of being rejected. The parents could say, no, we really don't like your hair, we don't think your school is clean enough, or, the guy across the street really has a more prestigious school. Rabbis did not put themselves in that position. The parents, or in other words, the student, always came to the teacher and applied. What Jesus did that was so different was that Jesus went up to people and said, you come and follow me. And what happened often was people looked at him and his offer and said, nah, no thanks. And what that shows us is the incredible humility of Jesus, that he put himself in the position of being rejected, that people don't like to be rejected. And Jesus did that. And it was just one more way that Jesus showed his humility. So I wanted to dig into that just a little bit. And not just that, but the kind of people that Jesus had to be his disciples. We think about the sons of thunder, James and John. The sons of thunder would come to call down fire on a Samaritan village that did not believe. These were hard men. Jesus does not have a group of refined intellectuals. He had a group of fishermen and unrefined men. I'm not saying they were unintelligent, but they were definitely uneducated. He called Matthew a tax collector who was one of the most hated groups of people in the entire nation. And these were his people. These were his disciples. Now, so what I wanted to come back to is that Jesus didn't need fantastically intelligent people. He didn't need Ivy League backgrounds. He didn't need the smartest. Jesus didn't even need good people. And Matthew is my chief example in that. Jesus didn't need highly intelligent people. Jesus did not need good people. What he needed was people who were humble and willing. And that's what we see in our text today. And so we see two kinds of disciples this morning. The first one that we see in verse 18 is that we see an ambitious disciple. Matthew chapter 8, verse 18. And when Jesus saw great multitudes about him, he gave a command to depart to the other side. And a certain scribe came to him and said, Teacher, I will follow you wherever you go. And Jesus said to him, Foxes have holes, and birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. We talked about this a couple of weeks ago on a Wednesday night, so I won't get too deep into this. But it's fascinating that Jesus makes this statement to this prospective disciple who has pledged, I will follow you wherever you go. Jesus reminds him in this incredible dose of reality, before you make this commitment officially, just know this, I am homeless. I have no home. And what we looked at in that lesson a couple of weeks ago was that when Jesus came here to be with us, to leave and forsake everything to come here and to accomplish our redemption, he left his home and he made his home with us. And so for at least the 3.5 or so public years of his ministry, he had no fixed address. His address was with the people. He was a shepherd looking for scattered sheep. He had no home. He gave up his home to come and look for us. But when he left here, he returned to his home with the promise in John 14 that he would make a place for us in his home. So when Jesus says, I don't have a home, that was a temporary condition. He left a home to come find us. And when he returned to his home, he makes a place for us. Know that. Know that. Now, Charles Spurgeon said this about this overly ambitious disciple who was a scribe. Now, a scribe was one of the ones who was basically like a human computer. He was a human copier. He would take the law of Moses, take an existing copy here and a blank scroll here, copy it off by hand. They knew the law incredibly. They were experts in the law. Charles Spurgeon said this, I wonder if this man thought, I'm a scribe. If I join that group, I will be a leader. They are only fishermen. And if I come in, I will be a great asset to that little group. I shall no doubt be the secretary. Maybe he thought there was something to be made out of such a position and such a commitment, end quote. He was overly ambitious. He had aspirations. And so Jesus reminds him, you do know I'm homeless, right? To the overly ambitious disciple. And then secondly, to the overly cautious disciple, verse 21. And then another of his disciples said to him, Lord, let me first go and bury my father. But Jesus said to him, follow me, and let the dead bury their own dead. Now, one thing is that Jesus knew what this man could not have possibly known, that Jesus' public ministry was this incredibly brief window that we talked about. For all that this man knew, Jesus was going to be around for another 20 years teaching. Jesus knew that wasn't going to be the case, but that man had some right to assume that Jesus was going to be here for a long time and that he had time to go on about his life as normal. And then when he got other things done, he could come back to this idea of following Christ in a more full way. Jesus knew all things and knew that time was much more limited than that. So I've wrestled with this exchange all week. Why does Jesus sound so harsh here? Because he does sound harsh. And I say that because we are weak and human and limited in our understanding, because just at face value, the man says, I need to go and bury my father. What that implies is that his father has passed away. And so based on everything else that Jesus has done, you would expect Jesus to respond with compassion. Yes, absolutely. Go take care of your family. And when you get that done, we will be here. And so it's surprising that Jesus answers in the way that he does. Jesus says, follow me, and let the dead bury the dead. That sounds so harsh. So what's going on? I always wondered about this because generally what pastors do is that they say, well, he was just buying time. He wasn't sincere about this. But my mind is one of those minds that always says, okay, yeah, but why? Where did you get that? I mean, that makes sense, but why? Well, as we look at this and in that society, I thought there had to be a reason why everybody says this about this guy, but I never had heard it explained. So in Mark 5 and John 11, as you see individuals passing away in the Gospels, what you find there are their family members immediately beginning to prepare them for burial. There was a Jewish tradition that held that a person who passed away should not remain unburied overnight. And so we don't assume that. We don't think about that being that quick in our society today, because that's not how we do this. But their society was very different. If a person passed away, they were going to be buried before nightfall. And so what we know from examples from Scripture and then also from Jewish tradition of the time was this: if this man's father were actually dead, he would not be talking to Jesus right now, because he would actually be at the funeral right now. So maybe that's where everybody gets that, what they say about this guy. I've just never heard it explained in depth. If the man's father were dead, he would be at the funeral, because the funeral always started the same day, and it would last for most of a week, 7 days before they went back to normal life. In other words, the guy's father, in all likelihood, was still alive. And that's why Jesus reacts the way that he did. Most likely, even though what this guy says tugs at our emotions, most likely it was a really good sounding delay tactic. Here's where this hits home. A lot of us will use excuses that impress people, but not God. A lot of us will have reasons that we will use not to serve God now that will impress people, but they make no difference whatsoever to God, because God sees through all of it. So if you ask someone, why didn't you stand up for what was right? Why didn't you say something? Why didn't you do something? When you saw that your brother was suffering, why didn't you speak up? Well, I believe in unity. I didn't want to be divisive. That sounds good, right? Sounds almost as good as I have to attend my father's funeral. But God sees through that stuff. Years ago, and far away, there was a pastor. And on a certain afternoon, a group of men from church came to his office. And they told him that the church was no longer behind him, and that in the upcoming business meeting, that there was going to be a motion that he no longer be the pastor, and in order to keep the peace and to keep things quiet, that the best thing for him to do would be just to resign, and that would just be the best way to handle it. So the pastor wanted to do the right thing. He wanted things to be easier on everybody, so that's what he did. He resigned. Not long after, a man came to the pastor and said, I'm sorry about all that. I'm sorry about how all that went down. I know it wasn't right. But you can move and start over, and you can find another church. But I have to stay here and live in this community and get along with all these people. And I just wanted peace. We're supposed to want peace, aren't we? I mean, that's a noble thing. But we're also supposed to stand up for what is right. As grown-ups, it's hard to know sometimes when to hit the gas and when to hit the brake. I want to do the right thing. I really do. I want to take care of my family, but I want to do the right thing. How do we know what to do? A cautious disciple, an overly cautious disciple, is one whose good intentions are outweighed by even greater reservations. D.A. Carson said about this first man, the overly cautious disciple, about the overly ambitious disciple. D.A. Carson said about him that this first man was too quick to promise. He was too quick to promise. And the second man was too slow to perform. And so in these two men, we see sort of the opposite ends of the spectrum of disciple behavior. Some are too quick to promise, and some are too slow to perform. Usually we think of these two responses as being like they are in the text, that they are two different kinds of people. But sometimes they happen in our own lives. I mean, like in your own life. Sometimes you have maybe been too quick to promise, and at other times you have been too slow to perform. And one of the best examples where we see both of these behaviors in the life of one person is in the life of Moses. In Exodus, what we find in Moses is that there was a time when he was too ambitious. As a young man of 40, that sounds kind of funny now, but compared to how long he lived, he was a relatively young man at 40. When Moses was a relatively young man, he was overly ambitious. And he had in his mind that God was going to use him to deliver the people from Egyptian slavery. And how he sought to do that was he withdrew and he murdered an Egyptian. Now that wasn't right. It wasn't God's way. It wasn't God's plan. He was overly ambitious because he thought that people would just recognize his divine call and rise up and follow him. And it wasn't the right time and it wasn't the right way. And he had to spend 40 years in the wilderness. He was overly ambitious. And then at the burning bush, as God calls him as a seasoned, mature man of 80, Moses at that point in his life becomes too slow to perform. And so as God makes his call clear to Moses and begins to say, this is what I want done, this is how I want it done, Moses then begins to stall, and he starts to give excuses. Well, I don't know what to say. I'm not a very good communicator. And he gives reason after reason after reason why he can't do what God clearly wants him to do. And then Moses finally gets to the point where he has this moment of clarity and honesty with God. And Moses finally says, send someone else. In other words, I don't want to do it. I don't want to do it. And above all other reasons why, I'm convinced the biggest reason why we don't do things that need to be done is because we don't want to. Sometimes there are very legitimate reasons why we don't get things done. Sometimes there are very real obstacles in the way. Sometimes there are things that absolutely prevent us from doing what we need to do without divine intervention. There was no way physically that Peter's mother-in-law, from a few verses before, there was no way that she was going to get up off that couch and serve with dengue fever or malaria or whatever she had, apart from a supernatural work of God. She was stuck where she was. And sometimes that is the case now. But by and large, we have been blessed with an incredible amount of freedom and liberty and purpose and information. And the main reason why we don't do what we need to do is because we don't want to do it. But we have some really good sounding reasons why we don't. Both of these men say that they want to serve and follow Jesus. I don't know that I could put a number on it. I am 20 years in ministry this year. I don't know that I could put a number on exactly how many disciples that I've seen on either side of this camp, the overly cautious or the overly ambitious. But I think it's fairly safe to say I've seen more on the overly cautious side. And the overly cautious disciple, their obedience is always conditional. You see, the overly ambitious disciple, they're always making declarative statements. I will do this. And they're always going to run in. They're always going to run in ahead. They're sort of the Peter in the Gospels disciple. They're always saying what they will do. They might do it, they might not do it, but they're the ones that you got to kind of pull back on the reins a little bit. They needed a little shot of humility and a little dose of reality, and you need to rein back on them. But if you can channel that like Jesus was able to do with Peter, you have an amazing leader. And that's what Peter was. If you can channel that sort of ambition, you have an incredible leader. That's what Peter became. That's what God did in the life of Moses. When you had that sort of ambition and God channeled it, you had an amazing leader. But it's hard to do something with somebody who doesn't want to do anything. It's hard to get that motivated. When Jesus comes into the house, in Matthew chapter 8, and this is verse 14, he saw Peter's wife's mother lying sick with a fever, and so he touched her hand, and the fever left her, and she arose and served them. The only thing that was a barrier to her serving was her physical condition. And there was no medicine at the time that would fix that. What she needed was a miracle. And so Jesus intervened, boom, she pops up and she begins to serve. How many of us are not serving in our full capacity because of a purely physical reason? No doubt some of you are, and I'm not knocking that at all, but I don't think that's the majority of us. What would it be like if Jesus would just pop into the doors of our lives, work a miracle, and liberate us physically to do what we would have a heart to do for the kingdom if we only could? That's what we saw the wonderful heart of this woman was. As soon as she was relieved from this physical burden, she began to serve. So what are you doing with the freedom that you have? Jesus healed Peter's mother-in-law so that she could serve. These two disciples in our text this morning, they don't need miracles. There's nothing physically wrong with them. They don't need a miracle. There's nothing wrong with their bodies. They just need to get their minds right. I think that's our problem as well. Most of us don't need physical miracles. Doesn't mean we don't have aches and pains, and some of us have very real physical problems. That's not what I'm talking about. We need mental makeovers to begin to be the disciples that Jesus can use. Humble, grounded, and useful. The overly ambitious disciple needs humility. The cautious disciple needs a jolt of urgency. And they both find their examples in the ministry of Jesus. To serve publicly, to serve privately, and whatever needs to be done for the kingdom, that's what we will do. There's an old quote about ministry that goes something like this. A pastor's job is to comfort the afflicted and to afflict the comfortable. I don't really want to afflict anybody, but I understand the general idea of that text is that when people are complacent, they need to have a sense of urgency laid upon them. And that was this man who said, I'm with you, Jesus, I'm with you, but I got to go take care of something at home first. And it sounded really good, but Jesus knew the situation that we don't really know. That's why Jesus responded the way that he did. And I would caution you in responding to people as harshly as Jesus did when you don't know the situation. Respond compassionately when you don't know what you think you know. The cautious disciple is afflicted. He's way too concerned with other things. He needs to be comforted, but also challenged to move forward. How do you know which one that you are? Like a self-test. How do you know which one you are? Are you overly cautious or are you overly ambitious? To be balanced, ambition and caution, they're both necessary sides of the same coin of being a fully formed, functioning disciple. We don't need to just run off doing whatever. We need to have a balance of caution and ambition, or we will never get anything done. We'll never do anything for the right reason. There must be some of that. We should be wise enough to exercise reasonable caution in what we do. Hebrews chapter 5, verses 7 through 9 says this. During the days of Jesus' life on earth, he offered up prayers and petitions with loud cries and tears to the one who could save him from death, and he was heard because of his reverent submission. Although he was a son, he learned obedience from what he suffered, and once made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation for all who obey him. That is a deep, deep thought, that Jesus himself learned obedience from what he suffered. And if Jesus himself can learn obedience, we have some learning to do. For the overly cautious and the overly ambitious, look to Jesus and learn from his ministry. If I didn't say this last week, I certainly meant to. Here's what we can learn from the public ministry and the private ministry of Jesus. If you are tempted to do things, if you're tempted to do good things publicly so that people will see it and clap for you, then do them silently, quietly. If you are scared of doing good things publicly because you are afraid that people will see you, then let your light shine and do them publicly. That is a great way to determine What is my motivation and what should I do? If I'm afraid that people will see me doing something good, then you maybe need to do that publicly. But if I want people to see me doing something good so they will think I'm a good person, then maybe you need to close your door and do something good at home. What are your motives? Why are you ambitious to serve? Is it to advance the kingdom or to advance your own brand? Are you eager to serve so that people will think more highly of your Jesus, or that they will think more highly of you? Who are you, and why are you here? If you are a reserved, hesitant, overly cautious disciple, why is that? What are the reasons that you have constructed that sound really good to people but not God? What are the reasons? The time to be a disciple is now. In case you haven't noticed, the world needs some kingdom people to step up and to speak up and to tell them about the Jesus who loves them. And if you're listening this morning and you don't know this, you need to know this, that Jesus loves you, that your life has value, your life is important, and we want to love you like Christ loves you, no matter who you are or where you are. May God bless you until we see you again. Amen.